It's a topic that's close to all of our hearts, and hopefully the world will follow. The reason I got into this field was because I was dissatisfied with my training in clinical psychology in the early 1960s. No one was talking about emotions, human or animal, and now I'm the director of a Center for the Study of Animal Well-Being, partially because I'm one of the few people in America that takes animal emotions seriously. And what I mean by seriously is that they actually have emotional feelings, and they are related to our own. And I follow this conclusion on the grand footsteps of the person we're in a sense honoring today, who gave us not only a way to look at the evolution of the body, but the evolution of the mind. And he said that the difference between the mind of other animals and human beings is a matter of quantity, but there's a continuity in mind. So I decided that the only way to understand human emotions was to study animal emotions. Our brothers, sisters, nephews, cousins, way far back before the Pleistocene. So, this is my map or kind of representation of Paul MacLean's contribution of a triune brain. We've got ancient brains inside our own brains. And you have taken evolutionary perspective to emotions and the mind. There are layerings. Evolutionary layering is the only organ you can see these of any of the fantastic organs we have. You can see the layering in the brain. And there's also a mental layering. And in order to understand our complexity, we have to understand the foundations. So these affects, these mysterious mental things, provide the comfort zones by which all of us live our lives. They are foundational. So our cognitive apparatus tends to follow our feelings. So do these guys have feelings? Well, here's Mark Bekoff, and he's written wonderful books like Emotional Lives of Animals, and he says it's a waste of time to ask if dogs have feelings, because obviously they do. Now that's the dilemma, saying they do, but not having a strategy on how to study how they're actually put together scientifically. And many people close the door. Nico Tinbergen, wonderful as he was, one of the fathers of ethology, said, because subjective phenomena cannot be observed objectively in animals, it's idle to claim or deny their existence. It's outside science. And he said this on page 4 of his wonderful book in 1954. Now, I think he's making an accurate statement with respect to animal behavior. It's always an inference. You have to have a sophisticated neuroscience before you can work out the mechanisms of affects. There's no other way, and that's why I got into the field 40 some years ago. Of course, here's the sin that we commit without neuroscience. But as soon as we have neuroscience, we can skirt this sin, and a lot of people don't understand the epistemology or the ontology. Here's one of them, who said, emotions are excellent examples of the fictional causes to which we attribute behavior. And he was led by another colleague, John Watson, a bit of a rascal, but I won't go into that. They gave us radical behaviorism and gave us wonderful tools, but gave us the wrong ontology and the incorrect epistemology to understand emotions. So if you don't have the tools, you should maintain your silence. These are the vicissitudes of early 20th century social bonds in science. They percolate down to the present moment. In other words, my clan of behavioral neuroscientists will not talk openly about the emotions of other animals, even though they have the tools. But because of the preaching that went on for a century about the impossibility of studying the nature of the mind, the book was closed. It's still closed pretty much. So that's how the animals lost their feelings in 20th century science. It's a tragedy. All we initially had, or now what we inherit, is ruthless reductionism. And ruthless reductionism essentially means that you can study everything you need to study by stimuli and behavior. External world. This means you can leave evolution out of the ball game. I'm sorry. That can't be the case. But all of a sudden the brain came in only in the early 70s because the cognitive revolution took all the jobs. Behaviorists had to become neuroscientists. That's where the money was. That's a historical lesson. But the mind was left out of the equation. Of course, we are not ever going to see it. It's invisible. It's a neurodynamic. And you have to use indirect approaches comparable to what the physicists use, where they're ultracyclotrons, looking for Higgs bosons, things like that. We have to look for the affects with a very similar indirect strategy. And once we have it for the animals, that will apply to us. And any intelligent person has to listen to the evidence and say, our little babies have profound feelings, because that's what the science indicates. Because all the other young animals we know have profound feelings. Why? Because the emotional circuits in the brain mediate rewards and punishments. That's the catch. They are not neutral. They serve as rewards and punishments, which essentially means the animal felt something. So anthropomorphism might not be all that bad, but you have to take a critical approach to it. And instead of saying fear-like behaviors, I think we have to talk about fearful feelings. I capitalize fear for a very special reason, not just emphasis. And that's what this book was based upon, the attempt to get at the true nature of the mental world. Of course, we only have judgments about the world, so we can make these two assertions, but we also have those same judgments. And where do we stand? If the red and the dark don't match up, we have an error. If animals have no emotional feelings, but our judgment is they have emotional feelings, that's a type 1 error. On the other hand, if the true nature of the world is the animals experience emotional feelings, but the animals don't have, then we have what they call the type 2 error. We try to avoid errors, so this is valid anthropo denial. They simply don't have what we have. We're special. We have a cortex of such massive proportions that it can weave together affects. But that's not where our affects come from. There's not one iota of evidence that's solid for the James Lange theory of emotions, namely the percolation of the body into the neocortex generates the idea of an emotional feeling. And after 120 years, we still believe it. In psychology, at least, academic psychology. There's no evidence for it. So this is a powerful emotion. We get angry and we get scared because of very similar systems in our brain. And it turns out that wherever you produce this anger response in animals, they turn it off. They don't like the feeling. So there is something like anger in the animal brain. And if we understand those circuits, we might have new treatments for, irritability disorders. Someone is continually getting angry and you say, take a pill. Well, we have no pill. But we do have knowledge about 7 basic emotional systems. We call them primary emotions. We capitalize them because this requires a specialized terminology for science. Otherwise, we have confusing conversations because of so many words. So what feeling does the seeking system, others still call it the reward system? The feeling is not pleasure. The feeling is enthusiasm. This is diminished in depression, and I'll show you one clinical trial we're running where we're facilitating enthusiasm directly through deep brain stimulation. That's the feeling in the vernacular. I'm using everyday terms here, of course, and there are many sources of anxiety in the world, but we only have one powerful fear system. And what shall we call the feeling of lust? Well, I thought of passion, but that is too broad a term. Now, care is tender and loving. It's hard to describe these pre-verbal powers of the mind. The panic system generates loneliness and sadness, and like I told you, in chickens we measure separation calls. So play brings you great joy. If you have too much psychological pain, namely the panic system, probably causes panic attacks also. This is the gateway to depression, too much psychological pain. If it's way beyond bounds, people begin to think about killing themselves. So we have developed one antidepressant by focusing on the molecular biology of happiness and joy, and it is currently in human testing. Yes, that is the way tender, loving feelings feel in the mind. It has a certain dynamic. It comes across in the body, the way the mother caresses a child. And a child that doesn't have that will have psychological problems for the rest of his or her life. So, if we understand these emotional systems, some of them will be rewarding, some are punishing, but they're never neutral. And that is the evidence that they have emotional feelings. And we can predict that if we stimulate the rage system in humans, they will be very angry. And
anger is the purest expression of care we have. Rage comes from the lack of control. A fear that you can't protect yourself or the people you care about.
And from the amount of anger in your file, I knew you were an incredibly caring person. Yeah, I know what I said.
But you don't know what it means.
What's that?
It means I'm gonna kick your ass.
When you separate a young one from the mother, they begin to cry because the mother is the absolute source of security. And we started measuring this crying and trying to figure out the neuroanatomy of it and the neurochemistries, and that has led to new treatments for depression as well as for suicide. If you take a little bird and they're born and they're walking around and they're crying, looking for their mother, as soon as they find the mother's wings, they settle down and they're comfortable. And we can simulate this by simply holding the little ones in our hands. They immediately quiet down, they feel comfortable, their beat goes down, and they fall asleep. This is because we're activating chemicals that counteract psychological pain. And the most powerful chemistry for this turns out to be brain opioids. That's a shocker. It turns out that our love and our attachment are partially addictive phenomena. They ride upon our internal opioids. They provide us with a sense of security that everything is right in the world. So there we are. That is the reason we become addicted to these molecules. And it's a tragedy of our country that we put people in jail as opposed to putting them in treatment facilities to explain what's happening in their brains. I think it would be wonderful if our government had an open conversation about the sources of addiction in our brain. Opioids mediate motherly love, the attachment bond between mother and child, the attachment bond between loving adults. And then we found that the molecule that releases milk from the breast also is very powerful in the brain in reducing the panic response, the separation distress response. And lo and behold, the molecule that manufactures milk in the breast is equally effective in reducing separation distress. So the physiology of motherhood is the physiology of love. And we mapped this system with deep brain stimulation in guinea pigs first, and then chickens, and the anatomy was the same, the neurochemistries were the same. And you see that in the guinea pig picture. a deep subcortical system where you can activate these separation cries. And even if you take an adult guinea pig that no longer cries, if you put an electrode in there, they will cry like a little baby as long as you provide the stimulation. So where does it go? It kind of develops inhibition from higher brain areas. Testosterone is something that counteracts crying. That's why there's a large difference in male and female emotions. Antonio Damasio imaged emotional feelings for the first time and found a very similar trajectory. And then Yankar Subieta at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, found that human depression and sadness were low opioids in these same brain areas. Remarkable. We are brothers and sisters under the skin with all the other animals, which provides us with a special responsibility for how we treat them in this world of ours. Because we know from animal work, if you overstimulate the separation panic system, it decreases the enthusiasm for life, as this attempts to summarize. And if you could elevate the seeking mood directly, the enthusiasm mood, it should have antidepressant effects. And lo and behold, they published this paper about middle of July. 6 of 7 depressed people that had not gotten any benefits from anything, including electroconvulsive shock, showed dramatic elevations in the desire to live and enthusiasm to do things in the world. They were basically normalized by facilitating the seeking system. And finally, we have been using play as a model for identifying new molecules for antidepressants. What would be better than some molecular pathway to facilitate social joy? The only thing better is to live in the human family happily with art, culture, music, all of the fine things in life.